I call on Dr. David Spencer.
Thanks so much for inviting me today. I'm here as a private citizen, and not in my capacity, my official capacity as a professor at the William J. Perry Center. So I'm responsible for what I'm going to say, and what I say does not necessarily reflect either the policy of the United States government or the Department of Defense. I have spent the last 22 years working in Colombia and studying FARC. I've developed a great relationship with people all across Colombia, civilians, military, police, and they have given me very privileged access to to information. So I thank the Colombians that have helped me develop what I'm about to say to you today. People are really happy about the peace process in Colombia, and they think the war is over, and I'm here to tell you that I don't think the war is over. First, I think that the ELN's out there, but I'm not going to talk about the ELN. But what I really think is that the FARC is actually transforming itself into what Hugo said was the Bolivian model. So let me talk a little bit about what the Bolivian model was. Five aspects of the Bolivian model. The first is violent social protest as the primary means to combating the government. The second is illicit drug money to fund the social protests and other activities. Third, a small armed element to protect drug crops from government eradication and interdiction efforts. And fourth, a legal political party to formally consolidate the gains made by violent social protest. And finally, a public relations campaign to portray the struggle not as cocaine traffickers against the government, but rather as indigenous people fighting against colonialism. These were the five elements that helped the MAS and the Cocaleros go from merely a regional organization to end up being the government of Bolivia. And again, as Hugo said, I think that the FARC is trying to replicate this model. Now, Colombia is a different place, and there's different contexts, and there's all kinds of different things in Colombia compared to Bolivia. There's a different society, and yet I think there are some significant. I think that the Bolivian model is a good template to apply to Colombia to see what's happening there. And let me explain how I think that those elements are playing out in Colombia. First, there is a significant increase in violent social protests. This began even before the conclusion of the peace negotiations. FARC began spending a lot of their effort organizing a variety of movements, representing a broad number of causes, and mobilizing these on multiple occasions to protest about most everything. In 2013 alone, there were 1,027 different social protests, the highest level since the government began recording protests in 1975, to include a nationwide agricultural strike that shut down a lot of the economy. Every year since, the number of social protests has increased dramatically. Significantly, the violent social protests is now being employed as a primary tactic to block manual eradication efforts in different parts of Colombia, Nariño, Putumayo, Catatumbo, and the lower Cauca region, shared by Antioquia and Chocó. And most significantly, the information I'm receiving is that the organizers of these social protests are FARC. Second, the explosion of coca crops throughout the country. When the negotiations started between the FARC and the government in 2012, the coca crop estimates were around 63,000 hectares. This grew to over 100,000 hectares when the government declared experimental crop substitution programs in Catatumbo and Putumayo, major FARC strongholds, and these never worked, of course. Finally, it exploded to around 153,000 hectares after the government ended spraying operations nationally in 2015 because of a national health risk, despite the fact that glyphosate via Roundup is still used to spray crop foods in Colombia that people eat every day. Last year's figures were 183,000 hectares of coca, and I suspect that this year's figures will be even higher. When the government ended aerial spraying in 2015, they assured the U.S. government that crops would begin to go down because the FARC was going to help the government with the eradication. But instead, at the root of each one of these leaps I've just mentioned was FARC encouraging, cajoling, and even forcing campesinos to plant more coca. If they were truly going to participate in eradication, why the efforts to plant more coca? Third, the dissidents and the militias. FARC main forces, about 6,000 of them, demobilized and turned their weapons in early 2017. But there has been a deafening silence about the approximately 14,000 FARC militias and their weapons. Why have these people been allowed to remain out in the cold? I don't know. Most of the military action during the last 4 years of the war were carried out not by the main forces of FARC, but by the militias. They had two major roles: controlling local populations and collecting money for the FARC. These people are still out there. Second, are the dissidents that exist now really dissidents? I'm not so sure. Two things make me think maybe not. First, there was only one case of violence between main FARC and a small element of the 14th Front that broke away. In this case, FARC sent their very best to suppress them, the elite Teofilo Forero Castro mobile column. So I think this specific group were indeed dissidents. However, with the other dissident fronts that broke away and refused to demobilize, there has been nothing, not a single drop of blood shed. Second, in FARC's declaration of its assets, they claimed that a large proportion of their resources from Southern Bloc and Eastern Bloc fell into the hands of the dissidents. This is absolutely extraordinary because, again, there was zero bloodshed. The FARC just passively let these assets fall into the hands of these groups. This does not compute because if there's one thing that I know for sure, it's that stealing or being perceived as stealing as little as 100,000 pesos, around $35, got you an immediate death sentence in that organization. Southern Bloc and Eastern Bloc were the main sources of FARC financing during the war and controlled up to 60% of the organization's assets. They gave up perhaps up to 60% of their assets without a fight. Who are they kidding? FARC political participation. FARC has established their legal political party that unsurprisingly is called FARC. The presidential candidate, Timochenko, is highly unpopular. He was run out of Manizales by people on the street and angrily ended his political campaign claiming lack of security. FARC is really that unpopular. However, the peace agreement guarantees FARC 5 seats in the 102-person Senate and 5 seats in the 166-person House. In addition, there are 16 special jurisdictions for victims. Since these are in areas of traditional FARC domination, it is an open secret that these 16 seats will go to the FARC. Potentially then, 5 Senate seats and 21 House seats will go to the FARC. Colombia has at least 6 major parties, so although not a majority by any stretch of the imagination, the FARC in Congress can become an important swing vote. The other problem is that their transitional justice program is problematic because although those that have committed crimes receive sentences of 5 to 8 years, there's no concrete restriction of liberty, and there is no limit on someone that is condemned from participating in politics while serving their sentence or even before being processed. Many people point out the low popularity of FARC in national elections, but I do not believe that FARC's plan is to win the national elections at this time, but rather to begin consolidating the regions. How are they going to do this? Through the government inability to fulfill all of the promises made in the peace agreement. An opposition analysis determined that to fulfill the agreement, the government would have to institute 130 new programs, and costs by different groups estimate that those 130 programs will cost somewhere between $3 billion and to $16 billion per year, the U.S. government estimating that it's going to be $10 billion per year. The problem is that Colombia does not have this money, and the international donors have not stepped up to fill the gap. So the FARC will use this failure as a banner to rally people to their side. But even if the government does fulfill the promises, they will claim credit for having negotiated those deals in Havana. So FARC wins whether the government fulfills or whether the government doesn't. I have been asked several times, does FARC really have the capacity to carry out this plan? Probably not at this moment, but not having the capacity has never stopped FARC from trying. In trying, they will create a new chaos in Colombia that we are not equipped to confront, and it will cost much blood and treasure to overcome, preventing Colombia from enjoying the peace and prosperity it truly deserves. Thank you very much.